Hey, mighty men of God, Joe Martin here at Real Men Connect, where we help good men become great men God's way. As you can see, I'm in my kitchen this morning, doing my quiet time, finishing up my quiet time. And even though I meet regularly, try to meet regularly with God every week, every day, if possible, to do record my quiet times, occasionally I like to share some of them with you when they really touch me or something that stirs my spirit. And this one, this is very familiar to you. I was reading this morning in Luke 22, in reference to Judas when he betrayed Jesus. Now, most of you, or you should be, pretty familiar with Judas' story that he betrayed Jesus and turned him over to the religious leaders so they could put him on trial and eventually crucify him. And I've heard the story hundreds and hundreds of times, even when I was a child. But as I was reading this morning, as I prayed and asked God to reveal something to me, something jumped out at me today that I think that can apply to us as men. And I want to share with you and be very transparent and very open with the revelation that I received. And it was in verse 3. Now, let me just read the first 3 verses in chapter 22 in Luke. It is now the feast of the unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. And in verse 2, the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put him to death, for they were afraid of the people. And in verse 3, and this is the key here, and Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12. Now, on face value, that really doesn't jump out at you, but it was the first part of that phrase, and Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot. Now, like I said, I've read this and I've heard about it many times, about how Judas betrayed Jesus for 20 pieces of silver. But I noticed in that verse when it said that Satan entered him, the question that came to mind for me, I can't speak for anyone else who's read that verse, was I couldn't understand how and why God would permit that to happen to Judas, who was a disciple. Of course, he wasn't a great disciple, but he was a disciple and a follower of Jesus Christ. How could he have permitted Satan to enter into him? And then it hit me because I remember in Psalm 37:4, and this is a very familiar verse that you guys have heard before, that if we delight in the Lord, he will give us the desires of our heart. That if we delight in him, he will give us the desires of our heart. And so when I read that Satan entered into Judas and God permitted that to happen, I said, why would that happen? And then it hit me from that verse that if we delight in God, he gives us the desires of our heart. So the question that we should ask is, if we don't delight in him, what will God give us, or what will God permit? And I thought about it, that if I don't delight and if we don't delight in God, you know what he will give us? The desires of our heart. Now it says, if we delight, now follow me on this, I hope I don't lose you. If we delight in him, he will give us desires of our heart. If we're delighting in him, God is going to give us great desires. But if we don't delight in him, wouldn't it beg to argue that he will give us the desires of a lustful, sinful heart? See, that's the key here. God says, if you delight in me, I will give you the desires of your heart, which is going to be aligned with his will. But if our heart is not aligned with his will, that means that we have desires in other areas that probably we shouldn't be pursuing. And so think about what the desires of Judas' heart was. It obviously wasn't being committed and loyal to Jesus. So it was going towards greed, probably disappointment because he thought Jesus was going to be this powerful, mighty Messiah who's going to reign and he can be right there with Jesus. And he realized that Jesus was talking about suffering and being crucified. And so a lot of things that Judas probably gave up, he probably resented Jesus for and thought, wow, I better get something out of this as quick as I can. So I think you get the point. So he started pursuing sinful desires. And what did God do in turn? God permitted Satan to enter into him. Now, I know this can be up for debate, but it makes perfect sense to me that if we're not pursuing the things of God and we're pursuing the things of the world, why wouldn't God allow us to go to the end of that road to see where it leads. Now, I can only speak for myself. I remember when I've taken my eyes off of Christ and the things that I desire in my heart wasn't good for me, but God allowed me to pursue those things and achieve those things until I realized that they were just vain glory. And I found myself coming back to Christ. So as I was doing my quiet time, and some of you have heard me mention this before, I record certain things that God speaks to my heart, and I use this acrostic called SPACE. Sin that I need to confess, a promise, P, that promise I need to claim, A, an attitude I need to change, and C, a command I need to obey, and E, an example I need to follow. So when it came to this particular verse, the sin that I needed to confess, and I'm just being transparent here, is that I need to avoid allowing the desires of my heart to go unchecked. And that might be a word for you too. Are your desires of your heart, are you checking those desires to see if they line up with God and that they are a delight to God? So the sin that I need to avoid is to not allow my desires of my heart to go unchecked. The promise, P, the promise that I need to claim is if I make my desires God's desires, he will protect me from the enemy. See, Judas lost his protection from the enemy because his desires went away from God. So if I make my desires God's desires, he promises that he will protect me from the enemy. So we need to always check our desires. So what attitude? A is attitude that I need to change. And I put down here that my Christian walk isn't just about what I want. Now let me say that. My Christian walk isn't just about what I want, but rather what God expects from me as it relates to my purpose here on earth. That as it relates to my purpose is what God expects, not what I want, but God expects from me as it relates to my purpose here on earth. And if I pursue my purpose that God has planted in me before I was even formed in the womb, then I will find delight in that, and I will find delight in the Lord. Now, the C, the command that I need to obey here is that I need to guard my heart and be watchful over it and not allowing the enemy a foothold. And so I'm challenging you to do the same. You need to guard your heart, be watchful over your heart, and not allow the enemy to get a foothold. And last but certainly not least, what E is the example I need to follow? I thought a perfect example of this would be David. David was a great example because what was David? A man after God's own heart. Now, David was not without his problems and his faults and his flaws, but he was a man. God said he was a man after his own heart. And no matter what David did, he always found himself pursuing God's heart. And we as men, we must do the same. So that's what I got out of my quiet time this morning. I just thought I'd share with you on the Real Men Connect. So as we always say that we're males by birth, but we are men by choice. So guard your heart and protect your heart and choose to be the man that God called and created you to be. Because a male is a terrible thing to waste. If this video has blessed you, please share with another brother who may need to check his heart to make sure it's in line with God's heart. I'll talk to you soon. Be blessed, stay strong, and as always, stay in God's grip.